Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss stories like this one. Your support means everything to us. The desert sun blazed overhead as Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her A-10 Warthog. She had been flying combat missions over hostile territory for 3 hours straight. Her aircraft had taken damage during a close air support mission, protecting ground troops who were pinned down by enemy fire. The hydraulic warning lights flickered on her dashboard, and she could feel the stick fighting against her hands. Every maneuver required twice the effort it normally would. Sarah had been in the Air Force for 12 years. She came from a family of pilots. Her father flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. Her grandfather flew bombers in World War II. Flying was not just her job. It was in her blood. The A-10 Warthog was not the fastest or the prettiest aircraft in the fleet, but Sarah loved it. The plane was built like a tank. It could take a beating and still bring its pilot home. Today, she was counting on that reputation. The radio crackled with urgent voices. Air traffic control was tracking her damaged aircraft. They could see on their screens that she was losing fuel and that her backup systems were failing one by one. The controller, a young airman named Rodriguez, kept his voice calm and professional. He had been trained for emergencies like this, but his hands were shaking as he watched the blip on his screen that represented Sarah's plane. He gave her vectors toward the nearest friendly airbase. A small forward. Operating base about 60 miles away, Sarah acknowledged the instructions and turned her aircraft toward safety. But the Warthog was handling worse with each passing minute. The damage was more severe than she had initially thought. Shrapnel from anti-aircraft fire had torn through multiple systems. She was running on backup power, and even that was starting to fail. The fuel leak was getting worse. She could see the gauge dropping faster than it should. Math was simple and brutal. She might not have enough fuel to make it to the base. Then 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons appeared on her wings. They had been scrambled to escort her damaged aircraft home. The F-16 pilots were young, probably fresh from advanced training. Their aircraft were sleek and fast, the complete opposite of her rugged Warthog. Sarah could see them through her canopy, their helmets turning as they inspected her aircraft from the outside. She knew what they were seeing. Hydraulic fluid streaming from her wing, panels hanging loose, scorch marks from near misses, and holes punched through non-critical areas of the fuselage. One of the F-16 pilots came over the radio. His call sign was Viper 21, and his voice had the confidence of youth. He reported her damage to air traffic control, describing what he could see from his position. His wingman, Viper 22, flew closer to inspect the other side of her aircraft. There was concern in their voices, but also something else. There was a hint of impatience, maybe even irritation. Sarah had encountered this attitude before from fast jet pilots who sometimes looked down on A-10 drivers. The F-16s were interceptors and multi-role fighters, built for speed and air superiority. The A-10 was a ground attack aircraft, slow and ungainly by comparison. Some fighter jocks called it the Warthog with affection, but others used less kind names. Sarah did not care about their opinions. She had a job to do, and she did it well. Her aircraft had saved countless lives on the ground, providing close air support that no other aircraft could match. Air traffic control came. Back on the radio with new instructions, the forward operating base was having problems with its runway. A cargo aircraft had blown a tire during landing, and the runway was temporarily blocked. Sarah would need to divert to a different airbase, another 40 miles beyond her original destination. Her heart sank. She did not have enough fuel for that. The math did not work. She would have to find somewhere else to land, and she would have to find it soon. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to stretch her fuel by climbing higher where the air was thinner and her engines would burn less. But her damaged aircraft was already struggling to maintain altitude. Climbing might push her systems past their breaking point. She could also try to find an emergency landing strip, maybe even a straight stretch of highway. But in this region, most roads were either destroyed by years of conflict or too rough for a safe landing. The F-16 pilots were still on her wings, and she could hear them talking to each other on a separate channel. Sometimes their radios would accidentally transmit on the common frequency. She could catch fragments of their conversation. They were discussing her situation, and their tones suggested they thought she should eject and abandon her aircraft. It was the safe choice, the by-the-book choice. But Sarah was not ready to give up on her Warthog yet. This aircraft had brought her through dozens of missions. It had protected ground troops and destroyed enemy positions. She owed it a chance to make it home. Viper 2-1 came on the radio again. This time his voice had an edge to it. He told Sarah that her aircraft was leaving a visible fuel trail in the air behind her. From his position, he could see the mist of aviation fuel streaming from her damaged wing. He recommended she prepare to eject. He said it was not worth risking her life for a damaged aircraft. Sarah thanked him for his concern, but told him she was not ready to punch out yet. She still had control of the aircraft, and as long as she had control, she had options. Then she remembered something from her briefings. There was an old airstrip about 20 miles to the east. It had been built decades ago, during an earlier conflict, and had been mostly abandoned since then. Intelligence reports said it was in poor condition, but the runway might still be intact. It was not on any official charts, and air traffic control probably did not even know about it. But Sarah had studied every map and every briefing before her deployment. She made it a habit to know every possible landing site in her area of operations. She told air traffic control about the abandoned strip. There was silence on the radio for a moment. Rodriguez was probably checking his database and finding nothing. When he came back on, his voice was uncertain. He said he had no information about that airfield and could not confirm it was safe for landing. Sarah understood his position. He was responsible for her safety, and he could not officially recommend she land at an unverified location. But she did not need his permission. As the pilot in command, the final decision was hers. The F-16 pilots objected immediately. Viper 2-1 said the idea was reckless. He argued that landing at an abandoned airstrip with battle damage and low fuel was asking for disaster. He said she should climb to a safe altitude and eject where rescue helicopters could easily reach her. His wingman agreed, adding that her aircraft was too damaged to risk an uncertain landing. Their voices carried the authority of pilots who were used to being listened to. Pilots who flew the Air Force's premier fighter jets. Sarah felt a flash of anger but kept her voice professional. She explained that she knew the risks, but she also knew her aircraft. The A-10 was designed to land on rough fields. It had been built specifically for operations from damaged or improvised runways. Its landing gear was incredibly tough, and its engines were mounted high on the fuselage to avoid ingesting debris. If any aircraft could handle an abandoned strip, it was the Warthog. The F-16 pilots went quiet after that, but she could sense their disapproval. She banked her aircraft toward the east, and the two F-16s followed. The fuel gauge was now in the red zone. She had maybe 10 minutes of flying time left, possibly less. The abandoned airstrip had to be there, and it had to be usable. If she was wrong about either of those things, she would have to eject over unfamiliar territory. She pushed the worry from her mind and focused on flying. The controls were getting heavier as hydraulic pressure continued to drop. She was essentially flying with manual controls now, using muscle and technique to keep the Warthog level. The desert landscape rolled past beneath her. From this altitude, everything looked brown and lifeless. Then she saw it, a thin gray line cutting through the sand. The abandoned runway. It was partially covered with drifting sand, and she could see cracks in the concrete even from the air. But it was there, and it was straight. That was all she needed. She informed air traffic control that she had the field in sight and was beginning her approach. Rodriguez wished her luck, and she could hear the genuine concern in his voice. Sarah set up her approach carefully. She had one chance to get this right. With her damaged systems, she could not afford to go around for a second attempt. She did not have the fuel, and she was not sure her aircraft would respond well enough for another landing pattern. The Warthog descended steadily, and she adjusted her speed and angle with tiny movements of the stick. Every input had to be precise. The aircraft was barely responding to her commands now, and she was compensating by using her experience and instinct. The two F-16s pulled up and circled overhead. They could not land on that rough strip with their sleek fighters, so they would observe from above. Viper 2-1 came on the radio one last time. He told her that the runway looked worse up close, with large cracks and debris visible on the surface. He strongly advised her to abort and eject. But Sarah was committed now. She was too low and too slow to safely eject, and her fuel was almost gone. She was landing this aircraft whether the runway was perfect or falling apart. The ground rushed up to meet her. She flared the nose just before touchdown, and the Warthog's main landing gear slammed onto the concrete with a jarring impact. The aircraft bounced slightly, then settled onto the runway. Sarah immediately deployed her speed brakes and applied the brakes. The Warthog shuddered and shook as it rolled over the broken concrete. She could feel every crack and bump through her seat. Debris kicked up around the aircraft, and for a terrifying moment she thought the landing gear might collapse. But the tough Warthog held together. The aircraft slowed, and Sarah guided it carefully around the worst of the damage on the runway. Her training and skill were the only things keeping the damaged plane under control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Warthog rolled to a stop about halfway down the strip. Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands still gripping the controls. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel sweat running down her back, despite the air conditioning in her flight suit. She had done it. She had brought her wounded aircraft down safely. She went through the shutdown procedures, turning off systems one by one. The engines wound down with their characteristic whine, and silence filled the cockpit. Sarah unstrapped from her ejection seat and climbed out of the cockpit. The heat of the desert hit her immediately, a wall of dry air that made her squint. She climbed down from the aircraft and walked around to inspect the damage. It was worse than she had thought. The hydraulic lines were torn, fuel was still dripping from the wing, and several panels had been blown completely off the fuselage. It was a miracle the Warthog had flown at all in this condition. Above her, the two F-16s continued to circle. She could imagine the pilots up there, probably shaking their heads at her decision. But she was down safely, and her aircraft was damaged but intact. That was what mattered. Sarah pulled out her survival radio and contacted Rodriguez at air traffic control. She reported that she was safely on the ground and gave him her exact coordinates. He responded immediately, relief evident in his voice. He told her that a rescue helicopter was already being scrambled and should reach her location within the hour. Sarah found a small patch of shade next to her aircraft and sat down to wait. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and she felt exhausted. She drank water from her survival kit and ate an energy bar, forcing herself to follow proper procedures, even though she just wanted to close her eyes. The F-16s made a few more passes overhead, then Viper 2-1 came on the radio. He said they were low on fuel and would have to return to base. He asked if she was secure on the ground. Sarah confirmed that she was fine and thanked them for the escort. The two F-16s waggled their wings in salute, then turned and streaked toward the horizon. Within seconds, they were just specks in the sky, and then they were gone. Sarah was alone in the desert with her damaged Warthog. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional tick of cooling metal from the aircraft. She stood and walked around the Warthog again, examining every detail of the damage. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rough edges where shrapnel had torn through the metal. This aircraft had saved her life more times than she could count. Today, she had returned the favor by refusing to abandon it in the air, as she waited for the rescue helicopter. Sarah thought about the F-16 pilots. They were good aviators, she had no doubt about that. But they did not understand the bond between an A-10 pilot and their aircraft. The Warthog was not pretty, and it was not fast. But it was loyal and tough, just like the pilots who flew it. She smiled to herself, thinking about how those fighter jocks had probably written her off as reckless or foolish. They would file their reports, and that would be the end of it. Or so she thought. The rescue helicopter arrived exactly when promised. It was a big Pave Hawk, and it kicked up enormous clouds of sand as it landed near Sarah's position. The crew chief jumped out and ran over to check on her. He looked her over quickly, asking if she was injured. Sarah shook her head and told him she was fine, just tired. The crew chief grinned and said that landing on this strip with a damaged aircraft took serious skill. Sarah thanked him. But inside she felt a warm glow of professional pride. The helicopter crew secured the area and set up a perimeter. A maintenance team would be sent out later to assess whether the Warthog could be repaired on site. or if it would need to be disassembled and transported back to base. For now, Sarah's job was done. She climbed into the helicopter, and within minutes they were airborne and heading back to the main base. Through the window, she watched her Warthog grow smaller. Sitting alone on that abandoned runway, like a wounded warrior, refusing to quit, when the helicopter touched down at the base, Sarah was surprised to see a small group of officers waiting for her. Her squadron commander was there, along with several other senior officers she recognized. She climbed out of the helicopter and saluted. Her commander returned the salute, then broke into a smile. He told her that word of her landing had already spread through the base. Everyone was talking about the A-10 pilot who had refused to eject and had landed on an abandoned strip that was not even on the official maps. Sarah was taken to the medical facility for a routine checkup. The doctors examined her thoroughly and declared her fit for duty. She was dehydrated and tired, but otherwise unharmed. After the medical clearance, she was sent to the intelligence office for a debriefing. She spent 2 hours answering questions about the mission, the damage to her aircraft, and her decision to land at the abandoned airstrip. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in the exact location of enemy anti-aircraft positions that had damaged her plane. Later that evening, Sarah returned to her quarters. She showered and changed into a fresh flight suit, then headed to the officers' club. She needed to decompress after the day's events, and she knew her squadron mates would be there. When she walked into the club, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Pilots from her squadron crowded around her, clapping her on the back and asking about the landing. Someone handed her a cold drink, and she found herself retelling the story to an enthusiastic audience. The celebration was interrupted when the door opened and 2 F-16 pilots walked in. Sarah recognized them immediately as Viper 2-1 and Viper 2-2, the pilots who had escorted her damaged aircraft. The room quieted as the 2 fighter pilots approached. Sarah stood to greet them, unsure of what to expect. The lead F-16 pilot, whose name tag read Captain Jake Morrison, stopped in front of her. His face was serious, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might criticize her decision. Instead, Captain Morrison extended his hand. His voice was respectful as he spoke. He said that after they had returned to base, he and his wingman had filed their flight reports. They had described Sarah's damaged aircraft and her decision to land at the abandoned strip. Their squadron commander had read the reports and had immediately pulled up Sarah's service record. That was when everything had changed. Morrison paused, and Sarah could see something like awe in his expression. He asked her if she had any idea what her tail number meant. Sarah was confused. Every aircraft had a tail number, a unique identifier painted on the fuselage. Her Warthog's tail number was just a standard designation. She said as much, and Morrison shook his head. He explained that after their commander had looked up her record, he had called Morrison and his wingman into his office. What the commander had told them had left both F-16 pilots speechless. Sarah's tail number was not just any number. It was legendary in the Air Force, though most younger pilots did not know the story behind it. Morrison pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo. It was an old picture, grainy and faded with age. It showed an A-10 Warthog with extensive battle damage, far worse than what Sarah's aircraft had sustained today. The tail number on that old aircraft matched the tail number on Sarah's Warthog. Morrison explained that this particular aircraft had a history that went back more than 30 years. It had been in service since the early days of the A-10 program, and it had seen combat in multiple conflicts. The aircraft in the photo had been flown by a pilot named Colonel Richard Hayes during a desperate mission to save a surrounded unit of ground troops. Hayes had taken massive damage from enemy fire but had refused to break off his attack. He had continued to make gun runs and deliver ordnance until the ground troops could be evacuated. By the time Hayes had finished, his Warthog looked like it had been through a shredder. Everyone thought the aircraft would be scrapped, but the maintenance crews had worked for weeks to rebuild it because they believed the aircraft had earned a second chance. Morrison continued the story, and Sarah listened with growing amazement. After Colonel Hayes and that historic mission, the Warthog with that tail number had been returned to service. Over the following decades, it had been flown by dozens of different pilots in numerous combat zones. Each time the aircraft was damaged, the maintenance crews would repair it. The Warthog became known throughout the A-10 community as the aircraft that would not quit. Pilots who flew it reported that the plane handled like a dream, always brought them home safely. But there was more to the story. Morrison explained that over the years, 5 different pilots who had flown that particular Warthog had gone on to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for valor in combat. 3 others had received Silver Stars. The aircraft had been present at some of the most critical close air support missions in modern military history. It had protected troops during desperate last stands, destroyed key enemy targets when no other aircraft could get through, and saved countless lives on the ground. The tail number had become legendary among those who knew the history. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had known her aircraft was an older model, one of the early production Warthogs, but she had never researched its specific history. She had simply been assigned the aircraft when she joined her squadron, and she had flown it in combat like any other pilot would. Now she was learning that she had been flying a piece of living Air Force history. The Warthog that had saved her life today was the same aircraft that had saved so many others over 3 decades of service. Morrison's wingman, young lieutenant named David Chen, spoke up. He said that when their commander had told them about the tail number, both F-16 pilots had felt ashamed of their earlier attitude. They had been dismissive of Sarah and her damaged Warthog, treating the situation as just another routine escort mission. They had not understood that they were watching a master pilot flying a legendary aircraft. Chen said that after learning the history, he and Morrison had immediately requested permission to fly back out to the abandoned airstrip to see the Warthog up close. Their commander had denied the request, saying it was not necessary. But he had ordered them to come to the officers' club to apologize to Sarah in person. Morrison said they were not apologizing just because their commander had ordered it. They genuinely wanted to express their respect for what Sarah had accomplished. Landing a heavily damaged aircraft on an abandoned runway was extraordinary piloting. Doing it in an aircraft with such a distinguished history made it even more remarkable. Both F-16 pilots shook Sarah's hand. Word spread quickly about the tail number and its history. Pilots who had been celebrating Sarah's successful landing now looked at her with even greater respect. Someone proposed a toast to Colonel Hayes and all the pilots who had flown that Warthog over the years. Glasses were raised, and Sarah found herself standing in the center of a room full of pilots from different squadrons, all honoring the aircraft that had become a symbol of the A-10's toughness and reliability. Later that night, after the celebration had wound down, Sarah walked alone across the base toward her quarters. The desert sky was clear, and stars blazed overhead in the darkness. She thought about the day's events and about the aircraft she had been flying. She had always known that the A-10 was special, but now she understood that her particular Warthog was something even more rare. It was a survivor, just like the pilots who flew it. The aircraft had been shot up, repaired, and sent back into combat again and again. It refused to quit, refused to be retired, refused to be anything less than what it was built to be. Sarah made a decision that night. When the maintenance team recovered her Warthog from the abandoned strip, she would be there. She would help with the repairs if they allowed her. And when the aircraft was ready to fly again, she would be the one in the cockpit. That Warthog had saved her life, and she owed it the courtesy of seeing it through this latest battle damage. More than that, she wanted to add her own chapter to the aircraft's long history. She wanted to be worthy of flying a plane that had been flown by heroes. The next morning, Sarah reported to her squadron commander's office. He told her that the maintenance team had reached the abandoned airstrip and was assessing the damage. The preliminary report was encouraging. The Warthog could be repaired, though it would take time and effort. Sarah asked if she could be involved in the recovery and repair process. Her commander smiled and said he had expected nothing less. He told her that the maintenance chief had specifically requested her presence, saying that any pilot skilled enough to land that aircraft in its condition deserved to see it brought back to life. Sarah flew out to the abandoned strip in a transport helicopter the next day. When she arrived, she found the maintenance team already hard at work. They had brought a portable crane, tools, spare parts, and everything else needed to make the Warthog airworthy again. The maintenance chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Tom Briggs, greeted her with a firm handshake. He had been working on A-10s for 25 years, and he told Sarah he remembered when this particular aircraft had come through his shop after Colonel Hayes's famous mission. Sergeant Briggs walked Sarah around the Warthog, pointing out each area of damage and explaining what needed to be done. The hydraulic lines would need to be completely replaced. Several control surfaces had sustained damage and would require either repair or replacement. The fuel tank would need to be patched and pressure tested. It was extensive work, but Briggs was confident his team could handle it. He said the aircraft had been through worse and had always come back. This time would be no different. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah spent every free moment at the abandoned strip. She helped the maintenance team however she could, fetching tools, holding components in place during installations, and learning more about the aircraft than she had ever known before. The maintenance crews welcomed her presence. They appreciated having a pilot who genuinely cared about the aircraft and wanted to understand how it worked. Briggs taught her things about the Warthog that were not in any manual. Tricks and techniques passed down from one generation of maintainers to the next. During those 2 weeks, Sarah also learned more about the aircraft's history. Briggs told stories about different pilots who had flown it and the missions they had accomplished. He showed her marks on the fuselage where previous battle damage had been repaired. Each scar told a story of survival and determination. Sarah began to see the Warthog not just as a machine, but as a testament to the courage of everyone who had been part of its long service. Pilots, maintainers, and ground crews had all played a role in keeping this aircraft flying for over 30 years. Finally, the day came when Briggs declared the Warthog ready for a test flight. Sarah performed a thorough pre-flight inspection, checking every system twice. The aircraft looked almost new, with fresh paint covering the repaired areas. The maintenance team had even polished the canopy until it gleamed. Briggs handed Sarah the maintenance logbook, which had been updated with pages of detailed repair notes. He told her to take good care of his aircraft, and she promised she would. Sarah climbed into the cockpit and strapped in. The ejection seat felt familiar, like coming home. She went through the startup procedures, and the twin turbofan engines came to life with their distinctive roar. All the gauges showed normal readings. The hydraulics responded perfectly to her control inputs. Sarah taxied carefully down the rough runway, testing the brakes and steering. Everything felt solid and sure. She lined up on the runway, advanced the throttles, and felt the Warthog surge forward. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing into the clear desert sky. Sarah put the Warthog through a series of gentle maneuvers, testing each system carefully. The aircraft handled beautifully, responding to her commands with precision. She flew for 30 minutes, pushing the tests gradually until she was confident everything was working perfectly. Then she brought the Warthog back to the abandoned strip for one final landing before returning to base. The touchdown was smooth. The aircraft rolled out without any problems. Sarah returned to the main base with the maintenance team following in the transport helicopter. When she landed, there was a crowd waiting on the flight line. Word had spread that the legendary Warthog was returning to service. Pilots and maintainers from across the base had come to watch. Sarah taxied to her parking spot and shut down the engines. As she climbed out of the cockpit, the crowd erupted in applause. She waved and smiled, but she knew the applause was not really for her. It was for the aircraft, for its incredible history, and for its refusal to quit. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Chen were in the crowd. They came forward to congratulate Sarah on the successful test flight. Morrison said that he had been telling everyone about the Warthog's history, and now half the base knew the story. He said the aircraft had become an inspiration to pilots from all backgrounds. It proved that toughness and determination mattered more than speed or glamour. Chen added that he had learned an important lesson from watching Sarah. He said he would never again judge an aircraft or a pilot based on first impressions. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued flying combat missions in her Warthog. The aircraft performed flawlessly, just as it had throughout its long service. Other pilots in her squadron began to request stories about the tail number's history. Sarah was happy to share what she had learned. The Warthog became a symbol for the entire unit, a reminder of the values that made the A-10 community special. Toughness, loyalty, and a refusal to quit when things got difficult. Months later, Sarah received orders for a new assignment. She would be leaving her squadron to attend a training course that would eventually lead to a position as an instructor pilot. It was a significant career move, one that would shape her future in the Air Force. But leaving her Warthog was harder than she had expected. On her last flight in the aircraft, she took it out over the desert and performed a series of aerobatic maneuvers, pushing the old plane through rolls and climbs just to feel it respond one last time. When she landed from that final flight, Sergeant Briggs was waiting. He handed her something wrapped in cloth. Sarah unwrapped it and found a small section of aluminum that had been cut from the Warthog during the repairs. It was a piece of the damaged wing, and Briggs had mounted it on a wooden plaque. Engraved on the plaque was the tail number and the dates of Sarah's service flying the aircraft. Briggs told her that every pilot who had flown this Warthog for an extended period received such a memento. It was a tradition among the maintainers, their way of honoring the bond between pilot and aircraft. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she thanked Briggs. She promised to display the plaque with pride wherever her career took her. And she made another promise, one that she would keep for the rest of her life. She would tell the story of this Warthog to every pilot she met. She would make sure that the younger generations understood what it meant to fly an aircraft with such a distinguished history. The legend of the tail number would live on, pass from one pilot to the next, inspiring new generations to embody the same toughness and determination that had kept this aircraft flying for over 3 decades.